Welcome back. We are in Chapter 2, Section 3, the carbon compounds. Make sure you read carefully when you go through the chapter in the textbook. There's a lot of important information in there. We'll go through, obviously, the major points, but you'll definitely get much more detail when you're reading in the textbook. The key concept questions we're looking at are the functions of each group of organic compounds. So organic chemistry is the study of all compounds that contain bonds between carbon atoms. Carbon compounds are also called organic compounds. And all living things are made from the same basic atoms: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. And I would like you to add one more. I would like you to add phosphorus, and I'll spell it for you. P-H-O-S-P-H-O-R-O-U-S, phosphorus. So if you put C-H-O-N and then you can add a P in there, together in different ways, you build different living organisms. So all organic compounds contain the elements carbon and hydrogen. You need to put a big highlighted box around this. Star this slide. You need to make a very big note that whenever you see or hear about organic compounds, you automatically remember they are made of carbon and hydrogen. They have to contain both of those elements to be considered organic, because the other compounds are going to be considered inorganic. What I would like you to do is pause the video, and you're going to place an O next to the compounds that are organic. So if you pause it now, and then I will show you which ones are organic. Remember, you're looking for carbon and hydrogen. So here we have an organic compound. This is organic, and this one is organic. The other ones will contain either carbon or hydrogen, but they don't contain both. Carbon atoms have unique bonding properties. Carbon forms covalent bonds with up to 4 other atoms, including other carbon atoms. Remember, they only have 4 atoms in their outer energy level, so they want 4 more. Carbon-based molecules have 3 general types of structures. You see here pictures of their structural formulas. They can form straight chains, just chains of carbons and hydrogens. They can form branched chains. They can form rings. Glucose, which is a type of sugar we will talk a lot about, actually has a ring-shaped structure. You're not going to have to remember the names at the bottom, pentene, hexane, and vanillin, but just know that these are structural formulas, and sometimes you'll be asked to pick out an organic compound and you'll be given images like this. What you need to look for is, do they contain carbon and hydrogen? That's all you need to be looking for when you're asked about that type of question. Many carbon-based molecules are made of many small subunits that are bonded together. These subunits are called monomers. If you look up the prefix mono on your yellow cardstock, you would find it to mean one or a single. And polymers, poly means many, so polymers are made of many of the monomers. So here you can see a long polymer. It's made of multiple monomers. Please make sure you highlight. There's 4 main types of carbon-based molecules that are found in living things. You need to memorize these. You must know these. Carbohydrates are the first one. They are going to be built with the molecules or the atoms carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Now here's an example of glucose that I just talked about. The left-hand structure is a more detailed structural formula, and then sometimes, just to simplify it so they're not writing all the extra hydrogens and stuff, they just write it as a single, just the simple ring shape on the right-hand side. Carbohydrates include things like sugars and starches. Monosaccharides are simple sugars. Remember, mono means one or single, And the root word saccharide relates to sugars. So that's a good one to remember, that that is talking about a sugar. Then we have polysaccharides. They're going to include multiple monosaccharides put together. You're going to see things like starch, cellulose, and glycogen. Cellulose is a storage form of starch. It's actually more structural in plants. If you've ever eaten celery and you get that stringy, chewy stuff, that's cellulose. The bark on trees is made of cellulose. Glycogen is an animal form of starch. It's a stored version of sugar. When you eat a lot of sugar or carbohydrates, it gets stored typically in your liver in the form of glycogen. Just a picture showing you some carbohydrates. Sorry if I made you hungry. Please make sure you highlight these important terms. Carbohydrates can be broken down to provide energy for cells. So that's their main function. If you're asked what is the function of carbohydrates, their main function is a very quick source of energy. Then there are some carbohydrates that are part of cell structure, and like cellulose, for example, or starches. If you've ever eaten a potato, you've eaten a carbohydrate, and it's a polymer. It's starch. So starch is a polymer of glucose monomers that often has a branched structure, and cellulose is more of a straight, rigid structure, and that's what gives plants their rigidity, or their ability to grow straight up. The different types of sugars are building blocks for the more complex carbohydrates. Anytime you see a name ending in OSE, and you should really highlight this, because sometimes you'll be confronted with weird words like galactose and fructose and just maltose, all these different words, but if they end in OSE, you know that it's a sugar. And that's a clue that will help you if you're looking at a question and you're stuck. So glucose, for example. Yes, I know, sound effects. Just making sure you're awake. So here's glucose, and you can see it's got that ring structure. Fructose is actually a little more complex. You'll find it in fruits. Sucrose, that's table sugar. A little more bigger molecule. It's considered a disaccharide, 2 sugar molecules. Maltose, they do use this type of sugar in certain alcohol beverages. Okay, moving on to our next organic compound, lipids. Lipids are nonpolar molecules that include fats, oils, cholesterol. You can add waxes. Many of them will contain carbon chains that are called fatty acids. And the fats and oils that you use every day will contain fatty acids that are bonded to a glycerol molecule. And here's a general structure of what they look like. The left-hand bar-shaped structure is more or less the glycerol, and then the long zigzags, those are the fatty acid chains. This is considered a triglyceride because there's 3 chains on it. So our second category, these lipids, they have several different functions. They are broken down as a source of energy, and they're actually a very good source of long-term storage of energy. Lipids also help make up cell membranes. They make up part of the structure called a phospholipid, and the cell membrane, the science term for it is a phospholipid bilayer. So you can hear there's a lot of prefixes and suffixes and root words in there. I recommend you look them all up so you understand what they all mean. Lipids can also be used to make hormones in your bodies. And so here's a diagram of the phospholipid bilayer. You can see that there are lots of different things stuck into the cell membrane. Now on the top part of the membrane and underneath it is inside and outside of a cell. and it's usually a water base. You know, your inside and outside your cells, there's fluid, and it's water that's that fluid. So you can see the tail portion of the phospholipids are all pointing into the middle of this phospholipid bilayer. And that's because they are nonpolar. They don't like water. So they are forced to kind of point inwards towards each other. And that's going to be an important thing for keeping things inside your cells that are supposed to stay in and keeping things out that are supposed to go out. But that's more, we'll talk more about that in our chapter 7 when we talk about cells. Fats and oils have different types of fatty acids. I know you've heard of things that are called saturated fatty acids and unsaturated fatty acids. There's also a thing called trans fat, which is really, really bad for you. I actually think they passed a law recently that they're giving companies a year or two to actually get rid of the trans fat in their food products, like margarine, for example, because it is linked to multiple different types of health problems in people. But a saturated fatty acid, if you look at this diagram, will only contain single bonds between those carbon atoms. Then if you compare it to the unsaturated fatty acid, you can see that there are several double bonds between the carbon atoms. So there's not as many hydrogen atoms connected to that chain. Saturated fats are not considered healthy for us, and it has to do with the fact that they don't have these double bonds. Unsaturated fatty acids are healthier for us. So things that are plant-based fats typically have unsaturated fats, and then animal-based fats are usually the saturated fats. Obviously the fat on a steak is saturated fat. Butter is considered a saturated fat that's an animal product. Oils and some margarines, depending on how they're made, are going to have unsaturated fats. Now here, also another clue is saturated fats will be solid at room temperature and unsaturated will be liquid at room temperature. Phospholipids, like I said, make up cell membranes. The polar phosphate head is going to face out where the water is, and the nonpolar fatty acid tails will be pointing inside towards each other. Okay, our next group of organic compounds are proteins. Proteins are polymers of amino acid monomers. You will need to remember that amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. There are 20 different amino acids that can be used to build proteins in organisms. If you think about the English language, there's 26 letters, and depending on how you arrange them and organize them, you can create all kinds of different words. Well, it works the same way with these amino acids. There's only 20 of them, but there are hundreds, thousands of different types of proteins, and it all depends on how you arrange those amino acids. This is the general structure of an amino acid. They are going to have the same basic format except for what is in red, and they call that the R group, and that's the area that can be different in all the different amino acids. So like I just said, the amino acids will differ in their side group or their R group. It's not important that you remember this, but just understand that that's the general structure. And the other key here is to remember an amino acid will have nitrogen in it, and that'll help you remember that it's an organic compound or what type of organic compound it is. Amino acids are going to be linked together by something called peptide bonds. Peptide bonds are a type of covalent bond. They're pretty strong, and they're going to link neighboring amino acids together. The other name for a protein is a polypeptide, and that's obviously coming from the types of bonds that they're going to contain. Proteins are an extremely important substance in our bodies. They control the rate of reactions and regulate all cell processes. If it were not for proteins, you would not work. Your body would not function. And they are pretty much the workers of every living organism. DNA is going to have the instructions, and then protein is going to be the worker. It's going to do everything in your cells. The types of substances that can control reactions are called enzymes. Sometimes they're called biological catalysts, and we'll talk about that in the next section of notes. The other function of proteins is they help build tissues like bone and muscle. They also help transport materials or help fight disease. You have a lot of different immune substances like antibodies that are made of protein that help you fight disease. Hormones in your body a lot of them are proteins. Some of them have certain shapes. Proteins actually are very specific in their shapes in order to function properly. And then our last group of organic compounds are the nucleic acids. They are polymers of the monomers called nucleotides. So if you put a bunch of nucleotides together, you get a nucleic acid. An example of nucleic acids are DNA, RNA, and a substance called ATP that we'll talk about in a couple chapters. Here you can see several nucleotides strung together, and it creates a nucleic acid. Nucleotides have the same structure. They have one slight difference, but they're made of a sugar group, a phosphate group, and a nitrogen base. You're going to need to know this eventually when we get to our DNA chapter, so you might as well memorize it now. The phosphate group is usually represented by a circle. The deoxyribose in DNA, that's the sugar name in DNA, is usually shown as like a pentagon, and then the base is either going to have a single or a double ring structure. The base is the part that's different in DNA and RNA. DNA stores genetic information, that's its main job. RNA is going to help make proteins that the DNA tells it to. And this is just a diagram showing you how DNA is actually making a copy of itself. The big yellow blob is a type of protein that helps hold the two sides of the DNA apart so that it can make a copy of itself. Here's RNA, that single-stranded molecule. That is a temporary copy of part of the DNA. Okay, that takes us to the end of our organic compound topic. Please make sure you remember that carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids are the 4 types of organic compounds, or carbon compounds. You're going to need to know that for the rest of the year, so please make sure you go back. I'd strongly encourage you to watch this video a couple times, because a lot of this information you're going to need this to build on for the future chapters that we do.